At about 10:30 a.m. on the morning of August 8, an Australian Hudson bomber from New Guinea sighted the Japanese force. The pilots had been working under orders for radio silence, but in the invasion they were told to break silence if something urgent seemed to be in the offing. The pilot of this search plane did not radio. He noted the ships and their direction, and then proceeded with his search mission, which took most of the afternoon. He returned to his base at Milne Bay, had tea, and then went into the intelligence office to report the contact. It was about 6 o'clock in the evening before the report of ships travelling down the slot was dispatched. The Australians reported to General MacArthur's headquarters, which reported to Pearl Harbor, which broadcast to the fleet, and that is how Admiral Turner got the word. But the report was fatally defective. The Hudson pilot identified the ships as 3 cruisers, 2 destroyers, and 2 seaplane tenders. When Admiral Turner read that message, he inferred that the enemy was moving to set up a seaplane base. The most likely spot was a protected harbour at Recarta Bay, about 175 miles from the landing beaches of Guadalcanal. So while the message indicated a Japanese response, it did not show the Americans what Admiral Mikawa had on his mind. Another Australian pilot, who correctly identified the Japanese force about half an hour after the first pilot, also delayed passing on the information, and his report did not arrive for many hours. As darkness began to lower over Sealark Channel, Rear Admiral V.A.C. Crutchley R.N., Australian commander of the screen around the amphibious force, sent his cruisers and destroyers to their night dispositions. He and Turner had divided the landing area into 3 defensive sectors. In the south were the cruisers Australia, Canberra and Chicago, and the destroyers Patterson and Bagley. Crutchley took personal command of this group, which was to patrol south and west of Savo Island, to prevent any enemy ships from coming through between the island and Cape Esperance on the northwest end of Guadalcanal. The northern sector ran from Savo Island to Florida Island, northeast of Guadalcanal. This area was to be patrolled by the cruisers Vincennes, Astoria and Quincy, and the destroyers Helm and Wilson. The officer in command of these ships was Captain Frederick L. Reefcole of the Vincennes. The destroyers Blue and Ralph Talbot were given a special mission west of Savo Island to cover the large sea area west of the channel, because they carried modern radar. The eastern sector ran from Lunga Point, where the Marines had established the first beachhead, to the approaches to Lengo and Sealark channels. Here, Rear Admiral Norman Scott was in command of the light cruisers San Juan and Hobart Australian and the destroyers Monson and Buchanan. Admiral Turner in the transport. Macaulay had personal command of the 19 transports and freighters. He planned to conduct unloading operations all night long because Fletcher's abandonment persuaded him it was imperative to move the transports away from the beaches at dawn. At 8:30 a.m. on the night of August 8, Turner called an urgent conference aboard his flagship. He had just learned that virtually no cargo had been unloaded from the transports at Tulagi, and he had to give General Vandergrift and Admiral Crutchley the bad news. Vandergrift had to be told that whatever supplies they did not get that night would be delayed, because the transports had to be taken away from the beach for protection. Crutchley had to be told that the surface forces would have no air protection for the next day or 2, and Turner had to tell both commanders that he expected the Japanese to send bombers the next day from that seaplane base. They could also expect air attack from Rabaul and Kavieng, and it was nearly midnight before the 3 commanders assembled in Turner's cabin aboard the Macaulay. They talked about the reports of the sighted Japanese vessels, and Turner said he was sure the force would head for Recarta Bay. The next morning, he said, Admiral McCain's land-based aircraft would bomb Recarta Bay. The 3 commanders did discuss the possibility of a night attack by Japanese surface forces, but Admiral Turner was not seriously worried. In the first place, as far as he knew, the air search that day had covered every area. In the second place, with the radar destroyers out front and with the disposition of the cruisers, he was confident that the protective forces could meet any challenge. At midnight, Admiral Crutchley and General Vandergrift left the flagship. The weather was cloudy, and rain hid the western horizon. It was too late for Crutchley to take the Australia South to his patrol area, so he ordered the captain to steam just west of the Guadalcanal transports. The clock said it was August 9. All was quiet, and Rear Admiral Mikawa and his staff had left Rabaul so rapidly that there had been no time to agree on a plan of attack against the invaders. Mikawa did not know the size or composition of the American force, and all these matters had to be ascertained. Early on the morning of August 8, Mikawa sent out float planes from each of his 5 heavy cruisers to conduct an air search. They were much more skillful and successful than the Americans, and 2 of them got a good look at the American invasion fleet between Tulagi and Guadalcanal. They came back to report having sighted a battleship, 6 cruisers, 19 destroyers, and 18 transports. The Japanese error was in slightly overestimating the strength by calling one cruiser a battleship, but that minor mistake did not have any effect on the planning or the outcome of Mikawa's operations. Admiral Mikawa's plan for action had been approved by the 8th Fleet and sent by radio to Tokyo. At first, the Naval General Staff considered the plans reckless, but after a few hours of discussion, it was approved, and no attempt was made to stop Mikawa. The planes reported sighting many American warships and transports around Guadalcanal. When Admiral Mikawa sent his search planes out 250 miles, he kept his force in the area north of Choiseul Bay, between Bougainville and Choiseul Island. It was in this area that the first Australian Hudson search plane found the Japanese force. To keep the plane away, Mikawa's ships put up an anti-aircraft barrage, and that was probably the reason for the pilot's faulty identification of 2 seaplane tenders, which lulled Admiral Turner into a false sense of security that day. Early in the afternoon, the Japanese cruisers recovered their float planes, and the striking force began to steam south through Choiseul Bay. At 4:20 a.m. in the afternoon, the ships were in the middle of the slot, and there they turned to parallel Choiseul Island and pass Vella La Vella and Kolombangara. Since those 2 sightings by the Australian planes, the Japanese forces had remained undetected as they came straight down. The only ship they saw was the Japanese seaplane tender Akitsushima en route to do what Admiral Turner expected, establish a seaplane base, but on New Georgia, not Santa Isabel Island. Admiral Mikawa had no time to dispatch couriers with formal battle plans to his captains. The flagship's signal blinkers began to work at dusk, sending the battle orders. All ships were to go in with guns and torpedoes to attack the ships at the Guadalcanal anchorage. They would dash in at high speed and dash out across Sealark Channel to Tulagi, strike the transports there, retire north of Savo Island, and steam back up the slot. As one last check on the plans, Admiral Mikawa sent out 2 search planes from the cruisers, and they returned to report that all was as it had been in the morning. The Admiral called on one of his staff officers to compose an appropriate message to the fleet in the spirit of the samurai. Let us strike in certain victory in the traditional night attack of the Imperial Navy. Let each man do his best, the message was sent to every ship, and so the men of 7 Japanese cruisers and 1 destroyer made their final preparations for battle. Shortly after 11 o'clock, Admiral Mikawa ordered 2 more seaplane scouts launched from the cruisers. They were to fly above the American ships, report on their night disposition, and remain over Guadalcanal to light up the sky at the proper time with flares. As the planes came in through the intermittent rain squalls, the burning hulk of the transport George F. Elliott was as good as a beacon. One of the Japanese scout planes was sighted by the United States destroyer Ralph Talbot, the Northern Radar picket boat. The Ralph Talbot's radio operator broke silence to give the alarm that a plane had been seen over Savo Island, heading east, which would bring it across the path of the American fleet. The warning was heard by the destroyer Blue and a few other ships, but for some reason it failed to reach Admiral Turner. Other ship commanders, hearing or seeing a plane, assumed that if it was unfriendly, Admiral Turner would have sent out a general alarm. On Guadalcanal, a little before 1 o'clock, 1 plane woke up a tent full of Marines. It did not sound like an American aircraft. The engine had a high-pitched tone that was unfamiliar, and it kept circling around the island, which seemed unusual. Suddenly, The Marines knew the plane was Japanese because it began dropping flares in several sectors of the sky over Guadalcanal and Sea Lark Channel, and they glowed with a greenish-white light. For an hour and a half, these float planes circled, broadcasting to Admiral Mikawa the dispositions of the transports and the steaming patterns of the cruisers and destroyers. The transports were the major target of Admiral Mikawa's planned attack. Before midnight, he ordered his force to assume a long battle column with his flagship, the Chokai, at the head, followed by the heavy cruisers Aoba, Kako, Kinugasa, and Furutake. Behind came the light cruisers, Tenryu and Yubari, and the destroyer Unagi. At 12:30 p.m. Admiral Mikawa issued his battle warning, and 15 minutes later the force was called to combat stations. Just before 1 o'clock in the morning, the Chokai crossed the track of the American destroyer Blue. The squadron trained its guns on the United States destroyer, but the lookouts aboard Blue saw nothing in the murk, and the destroyer steamed away to the southwest as the Japanese ships passed by. Admiral Mikawa was nervous, believing the Blue had reported his coming, and he changed course and then changed again when his lookouts reported another destroyer. At 1 o'clock in the morning, the Chokai rounded Savo Island, and just after 1:30 a.m. the lookouts saw the lines of an American destroyer 2 miles north. This ship was the Jarvis, the destroyer damaged in the Japanese air attacks that day. Her captain was taking the ship to Sydney for dry dock repairs. If the men of the Jarvis saw Japanese, they had no way of alarming the American fleet, because the destroyer's communications system was dead. The orders given by Admiral Mikawa before the battle had specified that ships should be prepared to fire torpedoes, and the cruisers fired several torpedoes at the Jarvis, but all missed. The Japanese ships did not open fire with their guns, because this was the prerogative of the flagship. Thus the Jarvis escaped, and the Japanese went on toward the American fleet, still unheralded. The Japanese continued to come at 26 knots, and the lookouts spotted 2 American destroyers, and then 2 United States cruisers 7 miles away. Still, the Americans were asleep. Admiral Mikawa ordered the ships to begin firing torpedoes independently as they found targets. The first targets were the cruisers Chicago and Canberra and the destroyer Bagley. It was fully 5 minutes after the first torpedoes were launched before the destroyer USS Patterson finally saw a ship of strange configuration 5,000 yards ahead, where no ship should be. The Patterson broadcast the first alarm. Warning, strange ships entering harbour. Even as the warning was issued, it was overtaken by events. Those 2 Japanese float planes began dropping their greenish flares, and the Chicago and Canberra were silhouetted against the land, and the Chokai opened fire from less than 3 miles range. The Aoba, 3/4 of a mile further away, also began firing, and so did the Furutake from just under 6 miles. As the lookouts aboard the Canberra sighted the enemy through the gloom, 2 torpedoes struck her on the starboard side. She was hit by several 8-inch and 5-inch shells from the Japanese cruisers, even as her general alarm bell was ringing. Captain F.E. Getting of the ship was wounded mortally, and the gunnery officer was killed instantly. The Canberra fired a few torpedoes and a few guns, but in 5 minutes her power failed and she went dead in the water. Strike 1 Allied cruiser when, having warned the fleet with blinker signals as well as radio, the Patterson turned hard left to engage the enemy. The captain shouted fire torpedoes, but no one heard him. A Japanese shell hit aft near 1 5-inch gun and ignited the powder. The executive officer, who was off watch below, hurried up, but so swiftly did the Japanese pass by that he scarcely saw them. Now, at least he had time to organize damage control parties, which was his function in combat, and to put out the fires aft. The destroyer USS Bagley saw the Japanese cruisers storming through, fired 8 torpedoes from the tubes on her port side, and the enemy column disappeared without firing back, and none of her torpedoes hit the Japanese ships. The cruiser USS Chicago was the object of the second run of torpedoes fired by the Japanese cruisers. Captain H.D. Bode, who had been asleep in his bunk, was only half awake when a torpedo hit the Chicago's bow and knocked part of it away. The Chicago's gunners began firing, but the star shells they put up to illuminate the enemy didn't ignite. The men didn't know what to fire at until they saw a grey shape ahead, and they began shooting at it. The shape was the destroyer Unagi, which Admiral Mikawa had sent back to cover the rear of the Japanese attack, lest some American heavy ships slip through by Savo Island and hit his cruisers as they were attacking the transports. The Unagi's searchlight was sweeping ahead of her, and the Chicago fired 24 rounds of 8-inch shells, and the searchlight went out, and the Chicago then turned on her own light, but found nothing. In the confusion, no one thought of informing the other United States cruisers of the attack. The Japanese steamed ahead, unreported to the transports even yet. At 1:45 a.m., Admiral Mikawa changed course and split his ships into two sections, the flagship leading 3 other cruisers on the west, and a second group of 3 cruisers led by the Furutaka on the east. The 2 Japanese cruiser groups turned north, guided by the flares the seaplanes had dropped over the landing areas at Guadalcanal and Tulagi. The American Northern Defense Force was steaming in a box pattern, with the cruiser Vincennes in the lead, the Quincy and the Astoria behind, and the destroyers Wilson and Helm on the flanks. It was only 5 minutes since the Japanese had gone into action, but the Canberra was wrecked and floundering, and the Chicago was out of the fight. Strike 2 Allied cruisers, when the Chokai fired 4 torpedoes at the first cruiser her captain saw from a range of nearly 6 miles. The battle against the 2nd American Defense Unit had begun, and that cruiser was the Astoria. When the Chokai came down, she was steaming along at 10 knots, and Captain W.G. Greenman was asleep in his sea cabin just below the bridge. The watch officer, Lieutenant Commander J.R. Topper, was on the bridge devoting his attention to keeping in line, so as not to disturb the box pattern, and the ship had just completed her turn to the northwest to begin a new leg. On the bridge all was quiet. The officers and men watched tracers and heard gunfire on Tulagi Island, and noted correctly that the Marines were having their troubles over there. Topper noticed a slight tremor of the ship's hull at 1:45 a.m., which he identified as depth charges exploding that was to be expected. Admiral Turner's messages had repeatedly warned of the danger of submarine attack. The tremor was actually caused by the explosion of the spent torpedoes the Chokai had fired at the Chicago. Topper had little time to worry about this oddity. However, because as he was speaking to the damage control watch over the intercommunications system, a lookout reported a plane overhead, and then a flare lit up the sky on the ship's port quarter. Soon it was not one star shell, but an entire string of them. The gunnery officer, Lieutenant Commander W.H. Truesdell, was the first man aboard the Astoria to sense the danger. He told the bridge to order general quarters, and as he did so, the ship was lighted by searchlights, and in a few seconds the first salvo of Japanese shells bracketed the Astoria. Truesdell ordered his guns to begin firing, and the first Astoria salvo went out. As it was fired, the captain came stumbling sleepily up to the bridge and demanded that the ship cease firing. He feared they were shooting at their own ships. Perhaps the junior officers had acted hastily. This stoppage threw the ship into confusion. A minute passed, and Truesdell pleaded to the talker, "Tell the captain, sir, for God's sake give the word, 'commence firing.'" The captain realized there might be a battle on and gave the order, but the debate had given the Chokai's gunners time to get the range, and as Captain Greenman gave the order, an 8-inch shell ripped into the Astoria, starting fires amidships. By the light of these flames, the Chokai poured shells into the American cruiser, and the Astoria was firing, but not accurately. She fired 11 salvos, but managed to hit the Chokai only once, a shell that smashed into the Admiral's chart room, but did not slow down the Japanese flagship. The Astoria was rapidly becoming a hulk. Both forward 8-inch gun turrets were destroyed. The float plane amidships caught fire and burned, and the 5-inch guns were wrecked. A shell hit the bridge and killed the quartermaster at the wheel and several others. The fires created such terrific heat in the engine rooms that the Black Gang had to abandon their stations. From stem to stern, the ship seemed to be ablaze, and after 15 minutes only No. 2 turret was still operating. Lieutenant Commander W.B. Davidson aimed its guns at a searchlight and fired the ship's last salvo. A shell hit the Chokai-S forward turret, but the big Japanese warship swept past. Strike 3 Allied cruisers when the American cruiser column's next ship in line, the Quincy, was the new target of the Japanese. As the Chokai devoted her attention to the destruction of the Astoria, the Ioba began firing on the Quincy. Like the Canberra, the Chicago, and the Astoria, the Quincy was unprepared for action. As the Ioba came up, she opened her searchlights on the Quincy, and in the bright light the Japanese on the bridge could see with wonder that the American ship's guns were still trained fore and aft. It was like shooting ducks in Tokyo Bay. Captain S.N. Moore had refused to listen to junior officers' assertions that the aircraft overhead for the past hour were enemy. When the searchlights came on, he ordered the guns to fire on them, then had second thoughts. What if they were friendly ships? And ordered his recognition lights turned on. Then he turned to starboard, precisely the wrong way, with an enemy shooting at him from the port quarter, and the Quincy could not fire her forward guns. That was the last error, and the Japanese shells began to hit. One struck the seaplane in its catapult and sent up a glow of flame that was as good as a beacon. The Quincy then came under fire from the Furutaka cruiser column, and after the Astoria began to sink, the Chokai also turned its attention to the Quincy. Station after station was wiped out by shells, the bridge went, and the captain was mortally wounded. The engine rooms were sealed off by flame, with no chance for the black gang to escape. The turrets were hit, and the small guns destroyed, and the sick bay disappeared in a shell blast. The ship was abandoned just after 2:30 a.m. in the morning, and she sank almost immediately. Strike 4 Allied cruisers, at least aboard the Vincennes the Americans were alert. At 11:45 a.m. the officers on the bridge had heard the warning from the destroyer Ralph Talbot that an enemy plane had been sighted, and Captain Reefcoal had instructed them then to exercise extreme vigilance. The warning from the Patterson that the wolves were in the fold did not reach them, but when the Japanese flares went up, Captain Reefcoal lost no time in getting to the bridge, and no time in worrying whether or not this was the enemy. General Quarters was sounding, and he did not question it. As he was going to the bridge he felt 2 underwater explosions, torpedoes going off nearby, and saw gun flashes and heard gunfire. But even then Captain Reefcoal and his officers believed they were under air attack only, and at 1:50 a.m. Captain Reefcoal saw the searchlights reaching for the American cruises. He assumed they were American searchlights, and asked by voice radio that they be shut off, but his gunnery officer, Lieutenant Commander R.L. Adams, trained his guns on the nearest searchlight. A salvo fell and splashed 1/4 mile short of the Vincennes, and she fired back, and on her second salvo hit the Kinugasa. But almost at that moment enemy shells began landing on the Vincennes. At least 3 of the Japanese cruisers were attacking her. The port side of the Vincennes bridge was destroyed by a shell. A dozen shells knocked out most of the small guns. Captain Reefcoal turned hard right and ran into 3 torpedoes from the Chokai. The fire rooms and the engine rooms were filled with smoke, and steam began to plume up from ruptured pipes and valves. A torpedo struck the No. 1 fire room and killed every man. Communications went out as the power failed. The captain, seeing 2 searchlights on the starboard side, mistakenly assumed they were friendly and ran up the American colours. The Japanese cruisers, mistaking the flag for that of a United States admiral, redoubled their shelling. By 2:10 a.m. the Vincennes guns were all silent. None remained that could be fired. The Vincennes was listing to port, and Captain Reefcoal was wondering if the moment had come when he should give the order to abandon ship, when the Japanese suddenly ceased firing and moved off, but the Vincennes was finished. She lingered a while, dead in the water. Most of the living got off and began to swim, paddle or float, clinging to jetsam. Then the Vincennes sank. Strike 5 Allied cruisers when the destroyers of the American Northern Group milled about, not able to ascertain the pattern of movements of the American cruisers, and therefore unable to help much. The Wilson saw the flares and was alerted, and then watched the Japanese column illuminate and attack the American cruisers. She opened fire, shooting at the searchlight 5 miles away. The shells did not hit anything. The Japanese threw a few shells at the Wilson, but were too busy with the destruction of the cruisers to pay much attention to her. She nearly was wrecked in a collision with the destroyer Helm, which suddenly appeared out of the darkness. The captain of the Wilson rang up full speed, turned hard left, and barely passed clear. The Helm's captain did not realize an action was in progress until he saw the American cruisers illuminated by the Japanese searchlights and burning. At 2 o'clock, the Helm went rushing off in pursuit of a ship, and discovered it was the United States destroyer Bagley. The Japanese were crowing over their victory, and they grew careless. The Chokai turned, but the others did not follow, and Admiral Mikawa had to run after them like a small boy chasing his peers. Just then, the burning Quincy, very near the point of sinking, hit the flagship with 2 shells. One wiped out the chart room, and the other smashed the deck near the aviation crane. A third shell only bounced off the forward turret, but still gave the Admiral something to worry about. Mikawa did not like taking punishment, so he ordered his captains to withdraw, and the Chokai column formed up and again, and sped off at 35 knots. The Furutaka column headed homeward and crossed the path of the destroyer Ralph Talbot. When the Japanese came down around Savo Island, the Ralph Talbot was on the other side of the Sound, near Florida Island, and thus missed out on the original action. Her bridge watch heard the Patterson's first warning call unlike the other ships, and she went steaming southwest at 25 knots to try to catch the invaders. The captain and crew could see the flashing lights of battle, but they did not know what was happening until, on the way out, the retiring Tenryu put a searchlight on the Ralph Talbot and began firing at her. Soon the Furutaka, Yubari and Tenryu were all firing at the destroyer, but she made an elusive target, and in several salvos the Japanese ships hit her only once, knocking out some of the torpedo tubes. The Ralph Talbot's captain, Lieutenant Commander J.W. Callahan, made a mistake that was very common that night. He assumed that the ships were American, called them up on voice radio, and turned on his recognition lights. But the call was answered by the Japanese cruiser Yubari, which turned its searchlight on the Ralph Talbot's bridge and began firing more rapidly. On the third salvo, the Yubari got the ship's range, and the shells began to cause damage. The chart room, gun control system, the wardroom, and a 5-inch gun were all destroyed or partly destroyed. The Ralph Talbot launched 4 torpedoes that did no damage and then ducked into a rain squall. The ship was burning and listed 20 degrees to starboard, and by this time Admiral Mikawa's column had reached a point north of Savo Island. Until now, the Admiral could be forgiven for not accomplishing his primary mission, which was to destroy the transports off the beaches. He had, to understate the case, been a busy man, but he was heading away from the transports, and the decision had to be made. Should he move back in and destroy them, or should he go home to report a phenomenal naval victory? His staff estimated that they had sunk 7 cruisers and 5 destroyers, and he decided to retire, and the United States transports were saved. Off Guadalcanal, the Allied Defence Force was in shambles, and the American and Australian navies had lost more than 1,000 men killed and 700 wounded. The Canberra was dead in the water. Her crew fought fires that blazed fiercely in spite of a heavy rain. Ammunition was exploding aft, which kept the destroyer Patterson, which had rushed to her aid, from coming in to assist her. After an hour, the Patterson managed to get alongside and pass over hoses and pump for the survivors, but it was too late. Admiral Turner ordered the ship either to join up with the transports or be destroyed. He was already planning to move out before the expected air and sea attacks of the daylight hours began. Since the Canberra could not move, she had to be destroyed, and the destroyer Ellet torpedoed her. The crew of the Canberra was rescued by the destroyers Patterson and Blue. The Patterson then went off and was nearly sunk by the Chicago, whose nervous captain at this point opened fire on anything that moved. but the destroyer and the battered cruiser managed to identify one another before the matter became serious. Luckily, their gunnery was not accurate, so neither was hurt by the other. Before daybreak, the Quincy and the Vincennes sank. The Astoria lingered on until noon of August 9, and then, despite heroic measures to save her by fighting fires and plugging holes, a magazine exploded, and she sank. The Ralph Talbot, although sorely damaged, managed to limp into Tulagi. The Japanese retired from the scene at high speed, because Admiral Mikawa was certain that as dawn came, so would the carrier planes, searching for him, but he did not reckon with the timidity of the American air commanders. Admiral Fletcher had retired before getting permission from Admiral Gormley, but 12 hours later, when he still did not have permission to quit, he apparently decided there were worse dangers than the enemy, and he headed back toward Guadalcanal. At 3 a.m. he received a report of surface activity in the Guadalcanal area, but he was too far away to do anything about it even if he had wished. Captain Forrest Sherman of the carrier. Wasp asked Rear Admiral Lee Noyes, the flag officer aboard his carrier and commander of the task unit, for permission to steam northwest at high speed until he reached launching distance. The Wasp's air group was one of the few in the Naval Air Force that had been trained in night operations. Admiral Noyes refused. A few minutes later, Captain Sherman asked permission again, and again it was denied. And still one more time Sherman pleaded, but Admiral Noyes, knowing Fletcher's state of mind, would not even forward the request for his decision. At 3:30 a.m. the long-delayed permission for Fletcher to retire came from Admiral Gormley, and Fletcher turned the force around again and fled south, away from the enemy. And on the morning of August 9, Admiral Turner had all the bad news. Earlier, in the conference with General Vandergrift and Admiral Crutchley aboard the flagship Macaulay, Turner had indicated that, since Fletcher had deserted them, he must get the transports out of the dangerous Guadalcanal waters before the next day's expected air attacks began. But on the morning of the 9th, surveying the carnage and wondering why the Japanese had left the transports untouched, Turner made the bold decision to remain in place at least for the day, so they could unload more supplies. General Vandergrift came aboard the flagship again, and they agreed that the transports would have to move out later that day. In the interim, a message came from Admiral Gormley ordering all surface ships out of what the sailors now called Iron Bottom Sound. Admiral Gormley also warned that the Marines would have to be prepared to repel Japanese reinforcements that were on the way. When General Vandergrift had that information, knowing that his men were likely to be short of supplies before the transports could return from Noumea, he ordered the Marines to go on the defensive. They would restrict their activity to patrols and shoring up defences against attack from the sea. So, on the evening of August 11, as the transports pulled away from the shore, 11,000 Marines on Guadalcanal and 6,000 on Tulagi were stranded. They had enough ammunition to last perhaps a week of heavy fighting. They had food for 37 days, and they had no air cover, no supply train, and no naval protection. The men ashore knew that a naval battle had occurred that night, but it was 2 days before they had the rumour that it had been a stunning defeat for the Allies. The fact that they were ordered to hold, place the main line of resistance on the beach and keep the reserve forces inland indicated that Vandergrift expected attack from the sea, but that is all the men really knew. Around the perimeter they flushed a few Japanese. Some snipers inflicted casualties, but were usually hunted down and shot. As of August 10, the Marines began to sweat out a counter-invasion by the enemy, and the tension grew, but the Japanese were not ready to follow up immediately on their victory. There were no air attacks, no enemy reinforcements appeared, and no warships except submarines moved in the slot, and these contented themselves with shelling small groups of Americans and small boats crossing from Guadalcanal to Tulagi. On the morning of August 9, Admiral Mikawa was worried enough about probable attack by American carrier planes that he ordered his cruisers into the rough circle of anti-aircraft disposition. The damage reports showed that the Chokai had only the chart room damaged. The Aoba had lost a set of torpedo tubes. The Kinugasa had a storeroom flooded when a shell went through the hull and had suffered steering damage, and the Kako had lost a float plane and its crew. All the ships had shrapnel and machine gun damage, but only 58 men had been killed and 53 wounded. When Admiral Mikawa reached Bougainville, the 4 heavy cruisers Furutaka, Kinugasa, Aoba and Kako were sent to Kavieng for repairs. The Chokai, Tenryu, Yubari and the destroyer Unagi went to Rabaul, and the groups parted company. On the afternoon of August 9, an Australian Hudson scout plane found and followed the Furutaka group but stayed out of gunshot. The pilot's report brought no Allied action on the surface because the Japanese ships were too close to their own bases, but the next morning the American submarine S-44 discovered the squadron. The 4 cruisers were steaming in the box formation, protected by a single aircraft. The captain of the submarine, Lieutenant Commander John R. Moore, decided to attack, closed in despite the patrol plane, and fired 4 torpedoes. Kako was hit and sank within a few minutes, carrying down many of her crew. When Admiral Mikawa stepped ashore at Rabaul, he was greeted by a special message from Admiral Yamamoto, congratulating him on his victory, but also reminding him that he must make very effort to support the land forces of the Imperial Army, which are now engaged in a desperate struggle. Mikawa may have gotten the hidden message, and privately, Yamamoto was furious with his subordinate for failing to carry out his primary mission of destroying the transports off Guadalcanal. Until Admiral Mikawa made his report, Admiral Yamamoto had not known the strength of the enemy in the area, and Mikawa exaggerated, but his story was an antidote for a more ridiculous tale. The Japanese military attaché in Moscow had told Tokyo there was nothing to worry about in the American invasion. The Americans had only 2,000 troops on the island, and their plan was to destroy the airfield and then withdraw. Even at this late date, the Japanese army had very little interest in the trouble at Guadalcanal. Lieutenant General Hyukatake, the commander of the 17th Army, was interested only in the Port Moresby invasion. Hyukatake said he could not help. He had no orders from Tokyo, and on August 10 the fleet hastily organized a very small force of 300 Navy riflemen and 100 troops of the 5th Sasebo Special Naval Landing Force and sent them to Guadalcanal. On August 11, Admiral Yamamoto detached Vice Admiral Nobutake Kondo's Second Fleet from the combined fleet in Japan and sent Kondo toward Guadalcanal. At the same time, Yamamoto made preparations to move his flagship and combined fleet headquarters to Truk. The naval battle that the Americans called the Battle of Savo Island and the Japanese called the First Battle of the Solomons had ended. The Japanese had scored an impressive tactical victory, but had missed their great opportunity to wipe out the supply ships of the invading forces. The American defences were decimated, the American carriers were frightened away, and General Vandergrift was persuaded not to move ahead to capture all of Guadalcanal Island. If he had been given supplies, he could have done in a day or two with his 17,000 men against the few hundred Japanese naval troops and the 2,000 labourers who remained on the island. The result of the lost opportunities for both sides was that there would be no lightning-like victory, but a long, desperate slugging contest. The reinforcement of the Japanese garrison at Guadalcanal was a full week in coming, and its composition was an indication of a major Japanese military weakness. A week after the American invasion, General Hyukatake still refused to take it seriously as a threat to his Port Moresby plan. Admiral Mikawa had asked for army help, but all he could get was the El Chiqui detachment, which had been scheduled to land and occupy Midway. After the Midway battle, this detachment had been taken to Guam and retained as a special unit not under 17th Army control. On August 15, Admiral Yamamoto ordered the creation of a Guadalcanal reinforcement force and chose Rear Admiral Raizo Tanaka and his destroyer Squadron 2 for the task. For the moment, the ships were loading supplies at Truk, and Tanaka was told to pick up 900 officers and men of the El Chiqui detachment who had been brought there and to take them to Guadalcanal. From the first, Tanaka was indignant. He could not understand how combined fleet could expect to do anything with fewer than 1,000 riflemen and no heavy equipment, bamboo spear tactics, he called them. Admiral Yamamoto and the Navy in general knew a good deal about the United States and Americans, but the reverse was true of the Imperial Japanese Army, particularly in the South Pacific. In all these years between wars, the Navy had been studying American methods and American psychology, but the Army had been deeply immersed in the Asian continent. If you asked a Japanese general a question about the Russians, he was likely to know the answer, but if you asked him about Americans, he was not. The extent of this ignorance was indicated at Rabaul, when Commander Keisuke Matsunaga, who had once been Yamamoto's aide, was asked by a Southern Area Army staff officer to describe the United States Marines. Just what sort of an organization was this? The staff officer demanded, and when told that the Marines were the soldiers of the Navy, the Army officer scoffed. Americans. They could be expected to quail at an attack and flee a banzai charge, abandoning equipment and comrades. Thus the Imperial Japanese Army entered the Guadalcanal conflict, and the Navy's flights over Guadalcanal and Tulagi had indicated the size of the American invasion operation. Navy pilot Saburo Sakai, looking down on the American flotilla off Guadalcanal on August 7, had said, "It was almost unbelievable. I saw at least 70 ships pushing toward the beaches, a dozen destroyers cutting white swaths through the water around them. And there were other ships on the horizon, too far distant to make out in detail or to count." This view would certainly dispel any belief that the American invasion effort amounted to the 2,000 troops reported by the Japanese naval attaché in Moscow. But Sakai was a Navy pilot, and his observations did not reach the enemy. The error persisted at Army headquarters, and when General Hyukatake decided to send reinforcements to Guadalcanal, he estimated that about 1,000 men could do the job, given the superior Japanese fighting spirit. Quite unaware of the developments in Tokyo and Rabaul, the Marines on Guadalcanal waited. On October 10, they stayed within their perimeter and cleared Japanese away from the north shore of the island. There was some shooting, but altogether it was a quiet day, so was August 11, and several times lookouts on the shore reported submarines. Whether it was one submarine or more was not ascertained, but there was no shelling, and the Marines' sleep was undisturbed. It was the same on August 12, except for an incident that was to colour the whole Guadalcanal campaign. While the island was quiet, General Vandergrift was eager to learn the disposition of the Japanese troops, and on August 10 he sent patrols through the jungle west of the Lunga River. They were forced back at the Matanikau River by heavy Japanese rifle and machine gun fire. The Japanese headquarters was located here. When a Japanese naval warrant officer surrendered, he told the Americans that the majority of the Japanese on the island were west of the Matanikau River. Furthermore, he said, he thought they might all surrender. One of the Marines said he had seen a white flag in the area during a patrol, and Colonel Frank B. Goetke, the 1st Division intelligence officer, decided to take a reconnaissance party in. The Goetke party went by boat to a point west of the Matanikau and then began to move inland. Within few minutes of landing, the Americans ran into a Japanese ambush. Colonel Goetke was killed, and only 3 Americans escaped. The flag they had seen earlier had been an ordinary Japanese military flag, white background with red rising sun in the centre. Folded, the red sun was concealed, and it had appeared to be a white flag of surrender. The Japanese had not intended treachery. They had never offered to surrender, but the Marines back at Lunga Point would never believe that. From the moment of Colonel Goetke's death, it was almost impossible to persuade the Marines in the line to accept surrenders on the rare occasions when the Japanese offered them. The Marines expected an attack at any time, and they prepared their defences as best they could without 70% of their supplies. The expedition had brought large guns for coastal defence, but they were still on the ships that had sailed for the safety of Noumea. The largest weapons available for the coast were a few 75mm guns mounted on half-tracked vehicles, 37mm anti-tank guns, and one captured 3-inch Japanese gun. The Marines were better prepared against air attack, and the ships had landed a number of 90mm anti-aircraft batteries on the first day. In fact, the Japanese pilots flying over the landing beaches on August 7 were astounded to see the anti-aircraft guns in place so quickly. In Japanese amphibious operations, it took a whole week to get anti-aircraft guns ashore, because more vital supplies came first. They did not know about the helter-skelter loading of the United States transports. From the beginning, supply was on American minds. On August 10, the ration was reduced to 2 meals a day, and Japanese rice began to supplement American foodstuffs. And on August 14, the Marines used their anti-aircraft guns for the first time. Japanese bombers came over the island at noon, 18 of them, and the dinner bell that served as an air raid alarm at General Vandergrift's headquarters began to jangle. Above, the Marines saw slender, silvery planes, flying at 27,000 feet to avoid the anti-aircraft fire. Their bombing was not very accurate, and most of the bombs of this raid fell into the sea. Only 3 Japanese planes came the next day at noon, but this time they were bombers and messengers. Commander Matsunaga had been ordered by Captain Masao Kanazawa, the commander of the 8th Base Unit at Rabaul, to fly over the Japanese positions on Guadalcanal and drop messages telling the men that help was coming. Kanazawa's 3 land-based Betty or Nakajima 96 bombers bombed near the airfield, wounding 1 Marine, and then dropped messages and food parcels for the Japanese defenders. The messages, attached to red tassels with long white cloth streamers, informed troops that they had dropped supplies and that help was coming. The Marines brought several copies of the message to Vandergrift's headquarters after an interpreter translated it. Later, Marines went out after the airdrop and recovered 14 packages that Kanazawa's planes had dropped. They were cushioned wicker baskets containing cans of meat, bags of biscuits, boxes of rice candy, and .25 caliber ammunition. The message began, "The enemy before your eyes are collapsing friendly troops. A landing party relief is near." The packages also contained copies of the Japanese Forces Special South Pacific Area newspaper. This edition reported on the Savo Island naval battle that had occurred in the slot earlier that week. Tokyo claimed the sinking of 1 battleship, 2 heavy cruisers, 3 light cruisers, 3 destroyers, 10 transports, and the serious damaging of 2 heavy cruisers, 2 destroyers, and L transport. The Japanese also claimed that they had shot down 32 United States fighter planes and 9 fighter bombers, dive bombers, and torpedo bombers. General Vandergrift, who knew what had happened on the sea, recognized the overstatement, but the Japanese on Guadalcanal could not be expected to do so. The Imperial General Headquarters was continuing the policy so lamented by Admiral Yamamoto, deliberate exaggeration and outright lying. For the moment, the news cheered the Japanese naval troops on the northwest end of the island and gave them renewed courage to await the reinforcement promised from Rabaul. That night of August 14, the scuttlebutt rumour started its rounds among the Marines. The enemy was winding up to deliver a smashing counterattack. The tension among the Marines grew by the hour until night ended and another day began. On August 15, the Americans had their first resupply since Admiral Turner's transports had left them 5 days earlier. The destroyer transports Calhoun, Gregory, Little and McKean brought in loads of aviation gas, bombs and ammunition. Admiral Turner was trying to make Henderson Field ready for aircraft. The passengers included Major Charles H. Hayes, who would be operations officer for the field, and Ensign George W. Polk and 120 mechanics to service the planes that were expected at any moment. The Marines then set to work to lengthen the field by 1,000 feet, but there was nothing they could do about the mud. What mud it was, viscous, clinging stuff grey-brown that clung to the men's boots and swallowed trucks up to the hoods. On August 12, an amphibious Catalina flying boat had made the first landing, and there were many pointed remarks about the nature of the plane it took to land on Henderson Field. But General Vandergrift insisted that the field was ready for use as long as the weather was dry. The Americans were not the only ones using destroyers for transportation. On the night of August 15, 1,000 soldiers of the Imperial Japanese Army boarded 6 destroyer transports at Truk and headed for Guadalcanal. The unescorted destroyers came down quietly on the night of August 18, past Savo Island and Lunga Roads, and through Lengo Channel to land at Taivu Point, about 20 miles east of the American position. Colonel Kiyonao Ichiki, the commander of the unit, still believed there were only 2,000 Americans on the island. With the 5th Sasebo Special Naval Landing Force troops, Japanese Marines who had landed at Tassafaronga, and the existing garrison bivouacked in the Matanikau River basin, Ichiki expected to work a pincers movement. He would move westward toward Lunga Point, and they would squeeze the Americans between them. The Japanese destroyers were so contemptuous of the American defences that they stopped to bombard Guadalcanal and Tulagi harbour after landing the troops. They shelled the airfield without effect, and they destroyed a landing craft that was running between Tulagi and Lunga Point. They bombarded the Tulagi docks. By the time they began to move in leisurely fashion up the slot, it was daybreak, and the Army's B-17s from Espiritu Santo had been informed of their presence. The big bombers attacked and scored one hit on the destroyer Hagikaze. She and the other ships moved leisurely no more but dashed back to Rabaul. The Americans first became aware of the Japanese reinforcements on Guadalcanal when Maji Martin Clemens, the Guadalcanal district officer, showed up at Vandergrift's headquarters with 60 members of the Solomon Islands Defence Force. The islanders proved invaluable to the Marines in tracking, and on August 19 led a patrol under Captain Charles Brush to one of Colonel Lechiki's units. The Japanese were moving west, in a column, without regard to patrol vigilance, and the Marines ambushed them and killed 31 of the 34 men. Examination of their equipment and belongings showed that they had landed recently. They had maps of the Marine positions, although they did not seem to have any conception of the Marine strength on the island. The Marines dug in along the bank of the Tenaru River, which ended at the mouth in a dry sandbar. They dug in along the west side of the bar and set tripwires and barbed wire on the other side at a place they called Hell Point, and put a 37mm gun to cover the bar. On the evening of August 20, the Japanese began moving from the east toward the Tenaru. They gathered in the thick jungle and waited. As the hours drifted by, the Marines waited on the west bank of the river. Midnight came, and the jungle was still silent, and 1 o'clock came on the morning of August 21, and still no action. But at 1:30 a.m. the Japanese launched an attack. 200 Japanese came storming up to the tripwire, the soldiers with their bayonets fixed, hurling grenades ahead of them, the officers swinging their long samurai swords. This sort of attack had paralysed Allied troops in the jungles of Malaya and Burma, but the Marines turned their rifles and machine guns on the wire, and the Japanese began to fall. The 37mm gun began firing canister shot, which spread out like big shotgun pellets. The Japanese went over, around and through the wire, and began to overrun the Marine positions, but the Marines stood their ground, swivelling in their foxholes to fire and coming out to slug with the Japanese toe-to-toe, bayonet to bayonet. By the time daylight arrived, all the Japanese who had forded the Tenaru were dead, and Colonel Ichiki's force was totally disorganized. His wile strategy had been based on surprise attack that would demoralize and destroy a small number of American troops. The tenacity and numbers of the Marines had turned the tables. The Marines sent a battalion upstream along the Tenaru, crossed the river and flanked the Japanese on the east. They squeezed the Japanese into a pocket in a coconut grove on the shore of the island. From the position beyond the Tenaru, field guns and machine guns kept the Japanese from crossing the river. As the Marines pushed westward, the Japanese fought back with a bayonet charge, but they did not get through. The Marines responded with a bayonet charge and disrupted the Japanese defence. Some Japanese soldiers took to the sea, and a few swam eastward along the coast to safety, but most drowned. Some managed to squeeze through the Marine line to the east and escape, but the majority of the 900 Japanese troops died in the palm grove. That evening, as the Marines brought up tanks and began knocking down the trees to eliminate snipers, Colonel Ichiki and several of his officers committed suicide, and the organized defense was ended. The Ichiki force of nearly 1,000 men had lasted just 3 days on Guadalcanal. The Marines had taken only 15 prisoners. They remembered the fate of Colonel Goetke, and they had lost 35 Marines killed and 75 wounded in this bloodletting. The Japanese reinforcement effort had failed completely, and the Americans had established a new confidence in their ability to stand up against troops who had been touted as the fiercest jungle fighters in the world. The successful Japanese attack in the waters off Savo Island made it very clear that the entire Guadalcanal expedition was in serious danger. For the moment, the island was isolated, and General Vandegrift and his 17,000 Marines might be in danger of annihilation unless help was brought before the enemy could stage a major landing. Had the Japanese been prepared to move 15,000 to 20,000 troops immediately, the outcome for the Americans would have been disastrous. So far, by August 20, General Vandegrift had been extremely lucky because the Japanese had first misread American intentions and then moved too slowly. The Japanese had not really understood that there was no reason to maintain strongpoints in New Guinea unless the Guadalcanal threat was removed. Admiral Nimitz was under the mistaken impression that at least Vandegrift's troops and the transport force were protected by Fletcher's carriers. With the announcement of the defeat at Savo, Nimitz hurried to dispatch 2 Marine fighter squadrons from Pearl Harbor, but they could not sail until August 15. He still thought there would be no gap, not knowing that Fletcher was miles away, and one of the major problems at this difficult period was communication, and the shoestring nature of the operation was nowhere more apparent. Admiral Gormley had located his headquarters at Noumea in New Caledonia, not realizing that due to weather conditions at this time of year, he could not communicate with Guadalcanal much of the day. Messages were routed to Auckland and then back up to Vandegrift. Also, communication between Noumea, Guadalcanal and Espiritu Santo, where Admiral McCain's land-based air force was located, were equally bad, which accounted in part for the American failure to spot the Japanese cruisers as they had come charging down the slot. As soon as word of the disaster at Guadalcanal was known, Admiral Gormley had asked General MacArthur to detail submarines of the Southwest Pacific Command from other areas to Guadalcanal, but MacArthur replied that to do so would leave Rabaul and Cavien uncovered. It was better to sink the Japanese ships as they headed south than to wait until they arrived on the scene. Gormley agreed, and so in the difficult days of mid-August, the only submarine the Marines saw off Guadalcanal was Japanese. So were the aircraft that hovered above the Green Island in the second 10 days of August. The Japanese had been hit hard by the anti-aircraft guns and the fighters from the carriers during the initial landings on Guadalcanal. When Admiral Yamamoto had realized the Americans were on the island in force, he had sent Vice Admiral Nishizo Tsukahara, commander of the 11th Air Fleet, down to Rabaul to take direct charge of operations.